the beginning of life and the universe. A comparative presentation between the creation narrative in the book of Genesis and the Big Bang and evolution theories. Genesis 1 Creation Story. The creation narrative in the book of Genesis was written around 3,500 years ago. This was when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness. The authorship is attributed to Moses. Imagine the kind of civilization they had that time, and their understanding about the facts of the universe. Obviously, it is not written to give a historical account of how God created the universe and the beginning of life, but rather to encourage the people of God to trust and believe in Him, their Creator, their Liberator, and their Provider. In the beginning, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And science has the black hole. It is a place in space where gravity pulls so much that even light cannot get out. The gravity is so strong because matter has been squeezed into a tiny space. Indeed, it is science. And science bases its facts on observable evidences through calculations and experimentations. Let us observe how the Bible and science are wonderfully entwined. Let there be light, creation day 1. Then black hole explosion happens, and there was light. The Big Bang Theory. This theory was first proposed by a Roman Catholic priest, Monsieur George Lemaitre, a brilliant Belgian who entered the priesthood following his service as an artillery officer in the Belgian army during World War I. He was also an accomplished astronomer and a talented mathematician and physician. In 1931, Lemaitre proposed in his hypothesis of a primeval atom that the universe began with the explosion of the primeval atom, what was later called the Big Bang. Big Bang theory remains to be the most widely acceptable explanation about the beginning of the universe. Let us watch this video.
The universe is everything, from the tiniest particles to the largest galaxies, to the very existence of space, time, and life. But how did it all begin? The origin of the universe is the origin of everything. Multiple scientific theories, plus creation myths from around the world, have tried to explain its mysterious genesis. However, the most widely accepted explanation is the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory states that the universe began as a hot and infinitely dense point. Only a few millimeters wide, it was similar to a supercharged black hole. About 13.7 billion years ago, this tiny singularity violently exploded. And it is from this explosion, this bang, that all matter, energy, space, and time were created.
Though plausible, certain limitations exist. Big Bang theory is very plausible, and the possibility of truth is very high, since all observable details are based on natural phenomena. But this presentation does not close the possibility of certain characteristics of the universe that are yet to discover. Creation Day 2. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." Creation Day 3. Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. After an explosion, a cooling process follows. Let us watch another video.
Within these regions, collisions frequently occurred. Small particles gradually grew to become planetesimals. Planetesimals continued colliding with smaller particles and other planetesimals, eventually growing to planets, such as the Earth. A number of planets were moving in the same orbit. The early Earth collided with a smaller, Mars-sized planet. Debris from this impact eventually came to form our Moon. The Earth-Moon system, as we know it today, was in place. Countless planetesimals and icy planets bombarded the early dry Earth. Due to the bombarding water-enriched planetesimals, the Earth became enveloped by an ocean atmosphere system. Water vapor in the atmosphere produced rain, forming an ocean. The atmospheric pressure gradually decreased. The carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere transitioned into a CO2 ocean covering the water ocean. Carbon dioxide also combined with rock components and was transported to the bottom of the ocean through weathering and erosion. At this time, the ocean was still toxic with a high salinity and an overabundance of metals. It was too toxic to support life. Upwelling mantle displaced the oceanic plates above. Uplift of the plate by mantle convection caused horizontal slippage due to the weight of the plate. This is plate tectonics in action. The oceanic plate subducted under the lighter continental plate. Weathered sediments neutralized the ultra-acidic ocean. heavy metals settled out and became fixed as deposits at the mid-ocean ridge. These deposits were transported through plate tectonics into the deep mantle. Gradually, the ocean became a habitable environment.
So generous is the nature for us living creatures. It gradually and patiently prepared our Mother Earth a suitable place to live. In particular, with its geomagnetic field to shield us from the direct irresistible sunlight. The beginning of life.
Gradually, the ocean became a habitable environment. By 4.2 billion years ago, a liquid core formed in the center of the Earth. Convection within the liquid core created a strong magnetic field surrounding the Earth. This geomagnetic field shields the Earth's surface from cosmic rays. The Earth's surface was nearing readiness for life. The early Earth, when the atmosphere prevented sunlight from reaching the surface. Primitive life was about to emerge underground, in the cave of a geyser. Uranium ore emitted large amounts of radiation, creating a diverse range of materials, and eventually producing the early building blocks of life. Water boiled and rose up to the surface, and the surface water flowed back down into the natural nuclear reactor. The temperature of the geyser water remained below 100 degrees, protecting the newly formed biomolecules. The underground environment was reductive, while the surface environment oxidizing. These conditions were necessary to synthesize biomolecules. In the Earth's Hadean eon, tidal forces were much more pronounced than they are today. Even lakes had significant ebb and flow of water, creating wet and dry cycles. These wet and dry cycles were one of the most crucial factors in producing the building blocks of life. Fatty acids came together, encasing the proto-life molecules. Polymerization progressed under the wet and dry cycles. Eventually, protein-like basic materials that could act as catalysts were produced. These molecules circulated between the geyser cave and the surface environment. The interactions of these materials led to more complex biomolecules. Proto-RNA combined with enzyme-like basic materials and evolved into ribozymes, which had the ability to replicate themselves. This laid the groundwork for life to reproduce. Finally, these molecules were enclosed within lipid membranes, forming primitive protocellular life. This was the beginning of life.
The flora and fauna. Creation Day 4. Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. Creation Day 5. Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. Creation Day 6. Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. Science has Charles Darwin. The Evolution Theory.
The belief that God had created mankind in his own image and likeness was shared by most Western scientists until the middle of the 19th century. They thought all the creatures of the planet had been conceived by a divine force. That is, until Charles Darwin arrived. Some researchers were already talking about an evolution of the species, but the British naturalist was the first to explain with evidence how evolution might occur. By natural selection. His theory radically changed biology, offering a new explanation of the origin of human beings. It also made him one of the most influential scientists and intellectuals in history. But to get there, he had to make an extraordinary journey, perform hundreds of experiments, and spend 20 years refining his ideas. In 1831, Darwin was 22 years old and studying at the University of Cambridge when he was invited as a naturalist to a great expedition. He boarded the HMS Beagle and spent almost 5 years traveling several continents, starting in South America, from which he brought back dozens of live specimens, illustrations, and fossils. These fossils gave him one of the first clues about evolution. For example, observing the remains of a mylodon, a giant animal similar to the sloth, he thought that those similarities were probably not a coincidence. There had to be some kind of link. When he stopped at the Galapagos Islands, Darwin also observed its giant tortoises, which lived in nearby islands but showed unique physical characteristics in each island. In the humid areas, where vegetation was abundant, the turtles had a short neck and a dome-shaped shell. Whilst in the islands with a drier environment, they had a saddle-like shell and a longer neck. But could he explain that difference? Upon his return, Darwin spent time observing how animal breeders and gardeners crossbred animals of a species to create new varieties. For that creation to be successful, the artificial selection made by man was key. Darwin realized that the natural world probably made the same kind of selection, but he couldn't explain how it happened. Until he read the work of Thomas Robert Malthus, a British intellectual from the 18th century. In an essay on demography, Malthus said that as the population in Europe was growing, at one point it would increase much more than the food supplies available, and that would cause a fight for survival. This idea helped Darwin explain how evolution works. In nature, there is a struggle for survival, in which the strongest individual is not necessarily the survivor. Instead, it's the one which best adapts to the environment where it lives. If a living being has any trait that helps him to survive, it will be more successful at reproduction. Those which don't adapt will die without descendants. The creatures with the most success in reproducing pass their traits to their lineage, and so on, until these variations end up becoming a new species. That's why the differences between the Galapagos tortoises were a product of evolution. In a drier environment, those with longer necks could reach the bushes easily in order to get food, whilst those who lived in the humid environment could eat grass and protect themselves from predators, thanks to their shorter neck and the dome-shaped shell. Darwin said that all species, including humans, were not created independently, but they descended from a common ancestor. From then on, life on the planet began to diversify. 20 years after his trip, Darwin had written thousands of pages, but he hadn't published any. He wanted to have irrefutable evidence, perhaps because he knew that his theory was going to cause quite a stir. But everything changed when he received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, an admirer and fellow naturalist who told him that he had reached the same conclusion. Evolution was produced by natural selection. Darwin panicked, facing the possibility that Wallace could take sole credit for the theory, so the two naturalists agreed to present a joint letter explaining their findings. But a year later, Darwin published his book titled On the Origin of Species, and he became a celebrity way beyond the scientific community. His findings shook the foundations of Victorian Britain. Like Copernicus in his time, Darwin changed the game by explaining that diversity came from a biological process without any interference from God. Darwin put human beings in the same evolutionary level as all the creatures on the planet. Scientific advances have confirmed his theory, and even the Catholic Church ended up accepting, decades later, that evolution is compatible with faith. And today, more than 150 years after Darwin's theory became known, we know that evolution is a fact. The planet keeps changing, sometimes dramatically, and we keep changing with it.
The question of whether we truly come from the apes is not the concern of this presentation. It is rather about the certainty of science that all living creatures come from a common element of primitive photocellular life that evolved into many different species. Darwin's frequent pairing of belief in God and religion with topics on superstitions and fetishism throughout his books can also be interpreted as indicating how much truth he assigned to the former. He eluded himself from believing in God and religion. That was self-limitation. Einstein's statement filled what is missing. Einstein called the Creator as the very intelligent being who engineered all of these things with certain perfection. This is obviously valid both for macroscopic and microscopic perspective towards life and the universe. Einstein's problem, however, was that he cannot identify the identity of this very intelligent being. He recourses into believing that God is everything. That is pantheism, a doctrine that identifies God in the universe. According to him, the discovery of God would be the greatest discovery in the human history. Believe it, it is never a coincidence that we believers discovered God in nature and in the Bible. This is all part of the greatest design of God in this process of revelation. Inspired by science and sacred scripture, we call him Elohim, God the Creator. Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. The reason why we are called human beings, because the word human comes from the Greek word humus, which means soil. That's who we are. Yet, man is the crowning glory of God's creation, created in his own image and likeness, the only creature endowed with the faculties of intellect and will. The only creature promised with salvation. A great privilege indeed. Along with this great privilege is our responsibility to take care of God's creation, that is stewardship. For we are all wonderfully interconnected, from the darkness of nothingness towards the sharing of the breath of life from our Creator. We all come from one singularity. We all come from God. It is worth to note that every day that God creates, He mentions that it was good. This implies perfection, because for God, there is no better nor best, simply perfection. The Bible explains about who, while the science tries to figure out the question, how. About the universe and all it contains. When? For 1,000 years in your sight are just like yesterday when it is past, like a watch in the night.